Welcome to Sinister Wisdom's conversation about the book Lesbian Death by Mairead Sullivan. We are going to have a fabulous hour together talking about lesbian ideas, lesbian lives, and lesbian deaths. My name is Julie Enzer. I am the editor and publisher of Sinister Wisdom, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's event. Before we begin, our tradition is to spend a moment for land acknowledgement. We are all around the United States and around the world, many of us living on occupied, unceded land. I am in what is now Dover, Florida, traditional homelands and territories of the Seminole. Please insert into the chat your location and acknowledge the land on which you live as we pause to recognize the histories of war and colonization, and to imagine and work for a world where we have a fair and equitable distribution of resources. We have an hour of conversation planned, and we will wrap up around 8 p.m. on the East Coast, including time for our traditional dance number at the end. To get us started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sinister Wisdom, and I have a ton of show and tell that I'm going to move through quickly. If you're not familiar with Sinister Wisdom, we are the quarterly journal of lesbian literature and art. Sinister Wisdom started in 1976, and we've been publishing consistently since then. One thing that is most consistent over our 47 years of publishing is that people have passionate feelings about Sinister Wisdom. Some of them love, some of them other sorts of passions. Particularly, people have strong feelings about what Sinister Wisdom is and is not. What I can assure you as we barrel towards our 50th anniversary is that Sinister Wisdom is many things. She is capacious and curious. She is open-hearted and honest. She is profoundly committed to lesbians, and she is, for the foreseeable future, here to stay. One of the things that we're celebrating this fall is lesbian creativity. We have our 2024 calendar in the small format, 6x6. This is available to everyone to purchase on our website, sinisterwisdom.org/calendar. And if you are not currently a subscriber and would like to become a monthly sustainer for as little as $3 a month, we will send you a free copy of the calendar. If you're currently a sustainer and you'd like to increase your gift by as little as $1 a month, we'll also send you a free copy, another free copy of the calendar, because all sustainers have already received their copy of the calendar. It's fabulous. I thank Belle Pitkin for being the curator this year and doing an amazing job with it. And I want to share it with everyone. My other show and tell things, if you're associated with a book club, a group of folks who might be interested in reading Alana Dykewoman's collection, Moon Creek Road, or if you're associated with a university, have an LGBT student organization, if you're involved with the lesbian club in your high school or any other kind of institution, and you'd like some copies of Moon Creek Road, I still have over 400 copies in the office. I'd be happy to ship some out to you for free, thanks to the generosity of the lesbian community. So again, that's Alana Dykewoman's Moon Creek Road. Just email me, julie@sinisterwisdom.org, and we can make those arrangements. Tomorrow around noon, the preview is going out for our fall issue with the cover reveal. I'm going to flash it to you, and I use that verb specifically. Here's our beautiful cover for our fall issue on the topic of We Teach Sex to Everyone. I tell my wife all the time, I did not plan to be living in DeSantis's Florida and publish an issue on trans feminisms and sex with a giant embroidered vulva on the cover of Sinister Wisdom, but I'm really glad that I've been able to do it. So we're thrilled that that's coming out. Look for the cover reveal tomorrow, and you'll be able to see the whole thing in all of its beauty. Thank you so much to Christy Lynn Ballooney and July Westhale for their editorial work on this issue. I have two other pieces of show and tell. One, we're not sure if Cookie Woolner's here tonight, but shout out to her. Her first book, The Famous Lady Lovers, Black Women and Queer Desire Before Stonewall, is just published today. So that's also a fabulous book for you to pick up. And tomorrow I'll also be sending to the printer the reprint of Judy Grahn's The Highest Apple, which we're able to publish thanks to the generosity of Sinister Wisdom donors this spring. It will be an extra bonus issue to all subscribers to Sinister Wisdom. Now I'm going to go fast through our housekeeping notes. Keep your microphones muted. If we hear from you, we will mute you. If you want to show appreciation for the speakers, wave your hands while people are speaking or when they're done. Use the reaction emojis on Zoom. You are welcome to test those out now. And feel free to light up the chat. Some of the best things that happen during our event happen in the chat. If you need technical assistance, Max is on deck for that. Max Bacher. Just a private back channel chat Max, and Max can help out with any technical assistance things. And we are, as I've told the 24 people who've emailed me today, recording this event, and we will make it available starting tomorrow or Thursday at sinisterwisdom.org/Lynn which is our current issue. Thank you. So this event is happening because when I read Mairead Sullivan's Lesbian Death, I wanted to talk about it, and I wanted other people to talk about it with me. One of the exciting things about this book is that I think it invites us to think about the past, not as something that is lost, but as something that gives us new ways to think about how lesbian might move forward. It complicates narratives that lead us to notions of disappearance and erasure. In framing tonight, I ask these questions. How can lesbians of the contemporary moment be in dynamic and vital conversations with lesbians in recent history? As lesbians and queer women's communities continue to evolve in light of the material conditions of our lives, how can we both honor our pasts and our presents and continue to imagine vital lesbian communities as a part of our futures? This panel, which is a fantastic gathering of folks, takes up Mairead Sullivan's book, Lesbian Death, Desire and Danger Between Feminist and Queer, to begin to think about these questions and others as we continue to assert and affirm the significance of lesbian as identity, community, and labile and labial source for our lives. I'm so excited for the conversation tonight. So without further delay, we will begin. In inviting everyone this evening, I described this event as being a mosh pit. And in that spirit, this is how we're going to proceed. First, I'll introduce our speakers, and as I go introduce each one, each will share 2 to 3 minutes of reflections on the book, what they found provocative, important, what new questions the book raises for them. Then we'll talk as a large group. And at the end, Mairead will come in and share some of her comments and responses to what we've been talking about. Then we will conclude with our usual dance number. We'll be done by the top of the hour, as we always are. Now, we're going to take our commenters, speaking in alphabetical order by first name. So the order that we'll have people in, and I'll give them a brief introduction, are Anne Svetkovich, Jack Geiseking, Joan Nessel, Olivia Polk, Rachel Corbin, and Sarah Ellen Strongman. Then we'll have them all in conversation with one another, overlapping, arguing, talking, nudging, and having a great time this evening. I'll provide the brief introduction for each speaker, and we'll put a longer bio into the chat, though I know many of you already know many of our speakers this evening. So to begin, Anne Svetkovich is professor in the Feminist Institute of Social Transformation at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. She's the author of numerous books, including The Beloved, An Archive of Feelings, Trauma, Sexuality, and Lesbian Public Cultures. Anne, will you please begin?
Yes. Everyone, can you hear me? I think I'm unmuted.
We can hear you fine.
Okay, I got to ungallery myself. So happy to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation. I don't know if I'm happy that my name begins with Anne, so I'm first. But I think one way it would be really interesting to have the conversation is just to position ourselves as respondents to the book, given Julie's suggestion that this is about intergenerational provocations. So I'm just going to mash together a bunch of words, all of which I identify with: lesbian, feminist, dyke, queer, femme, trans inclusive. I've also listed on Zoom. I often note that I use she, her pronouns. I'm white-bodied. I live on unceded Algonquin territory. I respond to the book as someone who thinks of herself as an 80s dyke, not to be confused with the 70s lesbian feminist, or often not wanting to be confused with the 70s lesbian feminist. I was shaped by many of the things that Mairead talks about: the sex wars, HIV/AIDS activism, the intersectional desires of feminism, sometimes failed, lesbian chic. I wore my Madonna t-shirt tonight in hopes that maybe we could talk about Mairead's take on the history of lesbian chic. And then also, this is really important for purposes of this group that I think spans a lot of different relations to lesbian culture and also the academy. I am a product of high theory from the 1980s, critical theory, queer theory, and as such, I feel that I was taught not just to criticize lesbian feminism, but in some ways to hate it or disidentify with it. So I just want to mark that because I really liked the way Mairead talked about ambivalence and love-hate relationship. I think that's a very powerful affective mood or demeanor, something actually that Lauren Berlant talks about in interesting ways in her recent book, and something that we might want to also explore, or Mairead might want to talk about more. So I want to also talk about reasons for my disidentification with lesbian feminism, for its essentialisms, which we were taught to think were problematic. Separatism, I got to go to a Mary Daly event in the 70s and figure out what it meant to have someone say no men allowed. But I also grew up with a lot of de facto separatisms. This would be something for us to talk about, is what are ways in which we are in gender segregated environments over time that affect how we think about separatism. There's so much to say. I was really intrigued by the chapter on separatism, Mairead. I see actually that we have Jeb in the audience, who's a member of the Furies, who might have things to add to your archive. I also want to identify somewhat tentatively as a longtime worker at the Michigan Women's Music Festival, who was always in favor of trans inclusion there. And I think that's a piece of history that's in danger of being lost or unnuanced because of tensions between trans and lesbian feminisms that I would like to see work in different ways. I wanted to throw into the mix, I'm sure there's going to be so much else, and I'm probably already over time, but I want to just say I also have feelings, a lot of feelings about the term lesbian death, and the question, is the lesbian dead? And I know, Mairead, you've tracked your way around this. I love this idea of following the category of death to different places rather than necessarily accepting it as a given. I think you talk about death as more of an anxiety than a historical fact. And I'll just say that I sometimes find myself not wanting to engage in the question of, is the lesbian dead? Because it feels like it already sets the terms of the discussion in ways that I want to sidestep. So I'm more interested, but I think your book takes us there, in the places where we get a kind of both and, where one could be a mishfest dyke and not a turf, where women of color feminisms and white feminisms can be in a space together, where lesbian and trans come together, where feminist and queer come together. I think we're going to hear about that from some of our folks around the table. I think we have a lot of strength in the room to talk about histories of Black feminism that I think have had a very different relation to intergenerational tradition and respect for ancestors. Audre Lorde's name comes to mind, Combahee River Collective, and that lineage through to folks like Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Adrienne Marie Brown, many others. I want to shout out to Joan Nessel. Did Joan make it into the room? Just because all hail Joan Nessel, my elder, who was a huge influence for my embrace of the sex wars, later for being able to rethink Butch Femme, which was one of the huge learning curves of my experience of intergenerational provocation and transmission, to understand that there were different generations of dykes, and that some of those generations needed to be reclaimed, and in fact could spawn, for example, new versions of Butch Femme in the 90s, I think paved the ways for various kinds of gender nonconforming identities and trans identities in the decades to follow. That it is a very complicated picture, and one that I look forward to discussing ideally with a group that represents many different kinds of positions and experiences rather than a singular one. I say that too because I think we're at a crossroads where we want to be doing good histories. We want to be creating dialogues between people who are still alive, including me. So there's a little bit of a like strange response I have to the book, where I see my own history being read through the archive by someone younger. And that needs to happen. Like, if the history is going to continue, the next generations need to be able to have access to it and make it their own. And we all are still in a situation where we have a lot of generations, just I think in the room tonight. And so what would a different kind of generational history and transmission of knowledge that might look very different than the way the Academy does business, but which I've learned from many different kinds of lesbian feminist communities that I've been able to participate in once I got over my academic critical edge. That's
Thank you so much, Anne. That's fantastic. Our second panelist we will hear from is Jack Jen Geiseking. Jack is an environmental psychologist, researcher, writer, and academic coach and book development editor. His first monograph is fantastic, A Queer New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes, and Queers, 1983 through 2008. It came out with NYU Press in 2020, and they are now working on their next book, Dyke Bars, Queer Trans Spaces for the End Times. Jack.
Wait, I'm muted. Perfect. Hi. So I'm so excited for this conversation to flow too. And I'm really honored to be here. As a geographer, I was utterly giddy to see so much talk about space and place and how important it is to lesbian identity. And I really was excited to kind of obsessively follow it, because I always read for space, between the way Mairead sets up the floating lesbian identity that can operate, and then these very like marked, aggressive, violent, political, which was thrilling for me, lesbians, and the really depoliticized lesbians, which was also unthrilling for me. I just want to say I love your writing. I'm sure other people will say that too. Like, the lesbian straddles both sides of the sex wars. It's just all in there. There's just so much giving you, and there's wit and clarity, there's actual sex, and there's a weird brevity for academic writing. It's like, it's so quick and so smart. I also, the thing that I was most excited about is, my moment of coming out. I would say I'm a 90s lesbian, butch, feminist, queer, trans, gender queer, still seeking that gender queer word for daddy out there someday, somewhere it's in the world. I saw a great TikTok about that. And I was thrilled about the discussion of lesbian bed death being a collective failure to hold on to a collective community, and the politicization of sexuality, and not these individual sexual failures in beds, in dyadic liberal relationships. And for me, that was particularly exciting because, going into grad school, queer theory was really about sex publics, but the sex publics were really about gay men. And it was always about cruising. And I, even in my book, I was wondering, I kept asking my lesbian, queer, trans, gender nonconforming participants, do you cruise? What is that? And it was about making eye contact in a bar. That was, there was like one person who was actually, out of like every 10 who might have had sex in a bathroom at a bar. But still, that kind of what how sex worked and what sexuality was kind of like, I guess I don't cruise. Am I a failure? Which also brings me back to your really great point about the constant sense of failure, which gets individuated, which also pairs with this under liberalism. And if we don't have this very alive, on fire lesbian bed, this collective lesbian bed, to share sexuality, we lose out on so much of our spaces and our communities too. And my last thought was thinking about, I wonder how, there's so many things. One is, why must it be the lesbian? Why is it always the lesbian? Why is it not? Oh, there's so many. Like, where is the multitudinousness? And I think that's why I'm thinking about the trans asterisk and the dyke having a conversation in the next book for me. And then also about how political economy, which is in the book, but doesn't get as front stage as much, to me, like thinking about rent and gentrification and policies, political policies in the real estate state, which you have like so clearly in Kristen Hogan's beautiful feminist bookstore movement book. And then thinking about a mega failure like Doc Marie's, which opened in Portland, Oregon, and had racist, classist owners and the entire workforce organized against them and shut them down, and they had to relaunch. So anyway, so many ideas to talk about. Thank you for writing this beautiful book, and we should keep going.
Thank you, Jack. Our next speaker is scheduled to be Joan Nessel. I don't see Joan on. Joan, if you're here under another name, by all means, unmute yourself. But what I'm going to do is pivot to Olivia Polk and have Olivia speak next. Olivia is a PhD candidate in American Studies, African American Studies, and women's gender and sexuality studies at Yale University. Olivia, would you please share your opening volley?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you, Mairead, for inviting me to be a part of this celebration of your book. I'm going to take up Anne's provocation to situate myself a little bit. I am a millennial. I'm Saturn returning, so I would say that I'm baby, but not for much longer. I'm a Black dyke millennial living in the U.S. South, in unceded Hialeah Saponi land, Durham, North Carolina. And the positionality that I am particularly entering this conversation with, and that I sort of entered from literally the cover of this book, is Anna Julia Cooper's axiomatic question of when and where I enter as a Black woman or as a Black feminized person. So early in the introduction, Mairead writes that, quote, I allow lesbian to float, often untethered to either persons or places. And respectfully, Mairead, I disagree. I think Lesbian Death is doing its best work as a text when it is read as engaging the impasses and the by turns melancholic and nihilist episodes that ensue when lesbian is asserted as a singular phenomenon attached to the twin modifiers of cisgenderness and whiteness. What Lesbian Death does, to my mind, is enumerate the problematics of whiteness for overdetermining our understanding of lesbianism. So Mairead reminds us that lesbianism doesn't have a demise per se, doesn't have to, but rather can explicitly become the condition of possibility for the furtherance of trenchant and multifaceted formations under the rubrics of, for example, Black queer studies, trans studies, questions of ecologies, care, and gentrification. It clears the ground for a discussion of lesbianism's vitality, which is what I hope we'll spend a lot of this discussion together doing. And those vitalities arrive when we think about the various ways that lesbianism has found a life attached to modifiers other than whiteness's silent one. So these attachments, which hew to the Black and woman of color lesbian sensibility that differences our strength, shape my interest in the engagement with Lesbian Death's genealogy. And I think for me, as a part of having this conversation and thinking about when and where I enter in a multifaceted lesbian way, I just want to call out the names of the people that have been, I think, a condition of possibility for my contemporary and intergenerational dyke living. And those people are the late Minnie Bruce Pratt. They are dyke mommy extraordinaire Susan Stryker. They are Jackie Alexander, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, the organizers of Philly's Dyke Night at the bike stop, in New York's Body, which is a testament that lesbian cruising does happen, but it's contingent on difference, right? Lesbianism as a vibrant category of difference. And then the last thing I'll say, as I think opening up my engagement with this book with all of you, and is again like a shouts out to Anne, which like, wow, how cool to be in this thing with you, and all of you, but is to say that I worry, as a part of engaging with this book, I found myself filled with worry, but a different kind of worry than what Mairead signals as a part of the condition of possibility of this book. I worry because like Treva Ellison and Riley Snorton and Matt Richardson, another very important figure to the genealogy of lesbianism and its archives, and Marshall Green have noted Black is a word that changes everything. And so that is always a part of my engagement with lesbianism. I worry about the invocation of lesbian death, or of the invocation of lesbian death as a way of signaling whiteness. In light of the Combahee River Collective's January 1979 pamphlet, that's not the statement, but is 11 Black women, why did they die? Which responded to the serial murder of Black women in Boston and was actually the catalyzing event for the later articulation of Black lesbian feminism in that vein, and all that sort of came after it. I worry about a story of the Barnard Conference in 1982, where we don't talk about Hortense Spillers' interstices and its implications actually for how we understand the ongoing negotiation of lesbianism, queerness at the intersection of danger and desire. These are some of the worries that I have, but I'm trying to take them up as productive ones that this book provokes and makes possible for us to engage in a structured way because of what you've given us, Mairead. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. As some of you probably noted breathlessly, Joan Nessel entered the room. I'm going to save Joan for the last introduction and continue alphabetically. And next invite Rachel Korbman to join us. Rachel is a scholar and public historian with a fabulous book forthcoming titled Conferencing on the Edge, A Queer History of Feminist Field Formation from 1969 to 1989. Rachel, join us in the scrum.
How do I do that?
There you go. Well, we're going to pin you in just a moment.
Okay, yeah. So I'm very excited to be joining this conversation and to talk about Mairead's fabulous book with all of you. I actually have a review of Lesbian Death coming out with Cultural Critique. So it's a very long review, so I'm going to be sharing a truncated version of it. So Mairead Sullivan prefaces their important new book, Lesbian Death, by admitting their own ambivalent attachment to the word lesbian. I have written this book because associating my work with lesbian makes me endlessly nervous, they explain, even as I cannot let lesbian go. This passage appears in the closing paragraph of the book's preface. It is also reprinted on the cover in yellow lettering against a soft lavender background, wryly mimicking the aesthetics of late 20th century feminist and queer artists like Jenny Holzer or Fierce Pussy, an aesthetic trace, that is, of the history that Sullivan cannot let go. I am of a generation that generally shares Sullivan's ambivalence. Lesbian feminism first took shape in the early 1970s as a political project that sought to dismantle the patriarchy by valuing emotional and erotic connections between women. 50 years later, lesbian feminism is often associated with anachronistic and bad politics. We often bristle at lesbian feminism's enthusiasm for women and lesbian as categories, which now smacks of gender essentialism and implicit whiteness. Many of us specifically worry about lesbian feminism's storied hostility towards trans people and especially women. To be clear, lesbian feminists did not share a uniform position on transness in the past or in the present, and indeed, lesbian feminists, some lesbian feminists either were or later became trans. Rather, lesbian feminism secured its transphobic reputation through a handful of frequently cited examples of trans exclusion in the 1970s and 80s, and the vitriolic transphobia of a small but vocal minority of trans exclusionary radical feminists in the present, who often position themselves as direct extensions of the past. New scholarship on lesbian feminism must then confront the reputation that precedes our object of study, even if we push back on the assumptions that lesbian feminism was truly as white, essentialistic, or transphobic as critics often assume. Sullivan intervenes in this conversation with a startling and generative argument that today's trans exclusionary feminists are not in fact a logical extension of lesbian feminists past. They make this case most forcefully in their analysis of a small group of lesbians who protested so-called trans activism at London's annual Pride March in 2018. In this protest, the group Get the L Out casts lesbians as victims of an imagined trans aggressor, a role that conjures, in Mairead's words, a passive and protected mode of white femininity. In casting lesbians as hapless victims, Get the L Out departs from earlier forms of lesbian feminism that, as Sullivan argues, enthusiastically embraced phobic constructions of lesbians as a danger to the world as we know it. For Sullivan, Get the L Out's retreat to a defensive posture has little in common with the politics of destruction differently enacted by lesbian separatists in the 1970s, anti-pornography feminists in the 1980s, or queer activists in the 1990s. I'll pause here to clarify that Sullivan is not calling for a simple reversal of a well-trodden history of lesbian feminist transphobia. That is, they're not ignoring the connections between the past and present. Rather, Sullivan's argument is probably best understood as an aggressive counter-reading of what we think we know. I'm borrowing aggressive counter-reading here from Jennifer Nash, who was in turn borrowing it from Judith Butler. In The Black Body in Ecstasy, Nash performs an aggressive counter-reading of the representations of Black women in racialized pornography, in which she strategically suspended Black feminism's tendency to focus on injury to instead read for pleasure and ecstasy. Similarly, Sullivan emphasizes Get the L Out's break from the past precisely because we have come to too easily accept a teleology that leads us from lesbian separatists to anti-pornography feminism to trans exclusionary radical feminists in the present. In prying open this story, Sullivan creates a space for lesbians to continue to function as a capacious political project of world building. I'm quoting from the conclusion there. I, for one, am excited to bring hummus to this world building potluck.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Next, we're going to bring on Sarah Ellen Strongman. Sarah Ellen is a professor at the University of Michigan in Africana and Women's Studies. Sarah Ellen, some opening volleys?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks to Mairead for this carefully researched and assiduously argued book, and of course to Julie for bringing us all together. If I can say anything about this book, and there's so much to be said about it, I want to be clear that Mairead is very clear about their project. Though the book has wide-reaching implications, their arguments are at times, despite the capaciousness of their archive, pretty narrow and focused. Previous panelists have already espoused many of its strengths and offered some provocative questions. I'm going to echo Olivia here a little bit by returning to this moment in the introduction where Mairead says, quote, "Across the project, I trace how these mourned lesbian projects are often coded as white," unquote. They go on to claim that they are repositioning the anxiety around the death of the lesbian as an anxiety around the loss of whiteness in defining lesbian legibility. In many ways, I read this book as purposefully a study of particular strand or strands of white lesbian feminism. Nonetheless, the non-white lesbian, like Victoria Hesford's Feminist as Lesbian, haunts this book. As someone who studies what Rachel and I have jokingly called the long 1970s, or a particular era and the long shadow it casts over academic debate, social movements, and cultural production, I was especially intrigued by how Mairead's project plays with and into the longstanding stereotypes and tropes of feminism and the capital L lesbian. In particular, many of the chapters do the difficult work of putting seemingly disparate bodies of literature in conversation, as in the chapter on separatism, which Anne Svetkovich mentioned earlier, where Mairead interrogates discourses around lesbian separatism and women of color feminism. Specifically, towards the end of that chapter, they turn to the Combahee River Collective statement and this bridge called My Back as sites that contest or challenge not just the viability of lesbian separatism as a political strategy, but more broadly what it means to do lesbian feminism, and what that might look like. Also, I just love that the chapter is called Killing Daddy. Mairead ends that chapter in many ways sort of tarrying with writing by Cheryl Clark and Pat Parker, two Black lesbian feminists and poets, and suggesting that what their work shows us is that a lesbian politics can be a coalition politics, a, quote, commitment to the messy work of revolution, of refusing to work within a given framework and demanding different worlds. And I buy that. Like others have said, I am with Mairead on this train of lesbian vitality, of the lesbian as disruption, but also as that person who is caught up in many ways is fascinated with sort of the recursiveness of lesbian death. I'm also subsequently fascinated with the recursiveness of the lesbian at all. As Mairead notes, the mythical lesbian is always white. And I want to know sort of why. The 1970s lesbian feminism that I study, specifically Black feminists, including members of the Come Behavior Collective, isn't white. And I'm wondering how the framework of whiteness, both in our critiques of it here, but also in collective memory, occludes some of the tension and nuances within 1970s and 1980s lesbian feminism. How might a consideration of the particular experiences of maybe white ethnic lesbian feminists, and I'm thinking particularly here of the work of Jewish lesbian feminists, especially like Ellie Bookin and Adrienne Rich, and their work in various both literary and cultural spaces. I'm thinking of Kristen Hogan's work and Becky Thompson's work, of course, and how they were in coalition with, or attempting to be in coalition with, Black lesbians and other women of color lesbians in this moment. How might that open up, even in the past, possibility and vibrancy of the category of lesbian feminism in ways that our sort of negative attachment to the 1970s feminist as bad forecloses?
Thank you so much, Sarah Ellen. And now, out of alphabetical order, but just in time, we'll hear from someone very familiar to our Sinister Wisdom community, Joan Nessel. Joan is a member of the Sinister Wisdom Board of Directors and author most recently of A Sturdy Yes of a People. Joan joins us from Australia. Good evening, Joan. You do need to unmute.
Okay, I'm sort of shaking with so much. It's a wonder to be here. I've already learned so much. I'm meeting people for the first time, and I'm seeing old lovers. It's how to plunge into this. I found your book disturbing and insightful. I want to just push things back. For me, being 83, and I think our histories are really created in the near history. So for me, it isn't the 70s, it was the 50s. And the 50s is McCarthy America. And the 50s is a time of bullies of all kinds. So that leads me, and this is so, first, I see I'm finding it hard to find the words because the monolithic lesbian is such a non-existing thing to me. And as a butch femme, as a femme woman, as a femme desirer, from the beginning, there were so many that didn't fit into any of this. And we're always fighting the closing down of possibilities. 3 words occurred to me. So what I'm trying to say is, coming out in the 50s, my key fears were bullies of all kinds. I can never champion Andrea Dworkin as a source of as how we should take on politics, because I lived through how bullying is. I saw what it did. And the irony that that's where we should end up bringing back the person who I see in many ways caused these problems in the beginning, because they and others shut the doors to difference. Well, I mean, if they wouldn't even accept sexual curiosities in a way. So I'm sorry, this is, you're also organized. I'm going to calm down. So the words, I look for the word whore. I look for the word freak. These are my words from the 50s. This, I look for the word femme. I look for the impossibilities and class. I look for what we create when we have almost nothing. And the other thing, every time you said the lesbian issue, all I heard, or the lesbian question, you would say the lesbian question, and I just heard the Jewish question. I just heard again this thing. There's an uncomfortable community that make people feel shameful, and the use of shame. Now, I've dealt and written about shame all my life because of coming out in the 50s. So this was really, I had to get my head around so much to see the lostness, almost, to me, there were sometimes grotesque turns of thinking, and to get us to say that that lesbians are complex and capable of things. It just so, and then I looked at the bibliography and I realized I am so behind in my reading. I am so you live everything, you know. So I was terrified of this in a way. And I want to thank Julie for asking me to be part of it. Okay.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you all. So we have so many, one of the things I wanted to put together were different generations. And I think that Anne raised an important question, this question of what is it to encounter your own history as it becomes the subject of history.
Yes,
right.
yes.
So those kind of personal connections. And I think one of the things that I appreciated that all of the speakers did was situate themselves in relationship to things. And Max, you can unpin me. I'm not going to talk that long, and put Joan back up. So I want to ask you what we have so many provocative things that come out of here. And I'm going to take a look too at what we see coming up in the chat, but what are some additional thoughts that people want to add? Olivia, Rachel.
One thing I didn't say, but I think I'm really excited that this book does, and I think in many ways, it's an inheritor of Anne's book, An Archive of Feeling, is the willingness to assert the lesbian presence in the first decades of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and in its organizing. So that's like, in the things that we can commend this book for doing, I want to take the time to really explicitly commend this book for doing that work. Especially as it's arriving into this moment where the sort of notion of pandemic death and its unevennesses, and the kinds of care that it will require, that it continues to require, because y'all, the pandemic is not over. You know, that particular account inside of this book really helps to build a history of a present that is really important, and is especially, I think, important in the context of thinking about this project as one that wants to be accountable to a kind of intergenerational set of relationships. So I just want to thank you, Mairead, for continuing to do that work as a part of the larger work that you've been doing.
Yeah. And I want to thank you too. I mean, I don't know how much of you just get all the alerts of lesbian ever in Google alerts, which is not fun to wade through. But the top thing is lesbian bars closing. And the next thing is a lesbian murder. And the next thing is a lesbian who was murdered. And so we keep seeing these same cycles of conversation, and what they are is they're about bodily death, and they're about our spaces and the end of an identity. And so, you know, it was lesbian bars are closing, and then we had the Lesbian Bar Project do this kind of Jägermeister funded thing. And now we see all these articles about resurgence and renaissance, and then someone immediately comes out with an article, well, what are we going to call them? I mean, we need to think of something else, because they're, you know, so I think there's also something about that, like that moment that also really fits the pandemic too, like what Olivia just said, and what everyone said too.
Oh, may I?
Go ahead, Joan.
I'm so sorry, Anne. I missed your talk, your introduction, and it's lovely to meet you. And I thank you for your blurb on my book. The other thing I had was just what you obviously talked about, was for me to read. There's a real, and you will learn it in your lives, I hope, the longevity of life, when what you lived becomes analysis, what you lived becomes a step in an adventure in thinking. And I read every page and I would say, no, I love penetration. I was one of those who loved, I've had breast cancer. I just kept ticking off. And the lesbian bar will never be the lesbian bar of the 50s. It doesn't work that way. The social pressures that created it and all of that. But I think the challenge, and I want to say, Mairead, that I'm so grateful to have read this book. I can see the terrible disruptions that have been caused when we need to be a coalition of resistors more than ever. Because what I see over all of this is the looming of fascism. And however we parse our disconnections, and somehow we have to find a way to find our mutual strengths and where we can live with each other. And so anyway, that's all.
It seems like one of the other themes from the comments that each of you made is a particular type of both what Mairead talks about is both identification and disidentification with an imagined sort of lesbian feminism. And the way it's fascinating to hear how that echoes across generations as you all speak. And you have your hand up.
Yeah, Joan, I'm sorry that you weren't able to hear what I had to say, because I really wanted to offer a major shout out to everything that I learned from you about archive making, about history making, about community, and the way in which my access to your work in the publications that came out of the Barnard Conference, but also A Persistent Desire, which is a 90s book that took us back to the 50s and helped to really reframe histories, has just remained for me as an exercise in humility, really, about the things we don't know, and then what it means, Joan, for you to not only write about your own experience, but, and I said this in my blurb on your book, to do this archival or editorial work that brings voices together in a complicated patchwork. And so that's also where I think, Mairead, what a lot of us, I think, are commenting on is sort of the choices that you had to make. I don't know if you want to comment on this, on kind of stitching together your response to these different really interesting categories through archival materials. And I, as someone who stands betwixt and between generations, I kind of like, for example, the putting oral history or live voices and archives together for me is really important. It was really important to my work around HIV/AIDS activism, meeting, actual flesh and blood lesbian feminists did a lot to undo, the thin archive that was just reading, as important as it is, Adrienne Rich's Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. And so I really, and I know a lot of you who've spoken, I know your work, and I know that you are creating these very mixed kinds of archives. And I just think that's really important, for people to be able to speak to each other and listen to each other, whether through these mediated forms like Zoom or collected anthologies or in a room together.
I'm going to pull a question from the chat that I'm then actually not going to give Anne time to talk about, but I'm going to read the question and I'm going to open it a little more broadly for people to think about. And then I'm going to invite Mairead to come in and share a little bit. So Anne Charles asks, Anne Svetkovich, will you explain the distinction you draw between lesbian feminism of the 70s and the 80s? And I just want to open the question, right, and again, not give anyone any time to respond to it, but us all to think about distinctions that we make about lesbian feminism in multiple decades. Jack talked about coming out in the 90s and the nuances, which I think are further extensions of defining lesbian feminism that Anne was getting at from the 80s and from the 70s. And I think everyone brings different definitions according to their generational moment. So I want to raise up that question, completely frustrate that question. And now I want to invite Mairead to come on and share some thoughts.
Thanks, Julie. Wow. First of all, thank you, everyone. I mean, I'm just like, I'm afraid I'm going to cry through my whole 5 minutes. I'm so overwhelmed by the comments from our panelists, by the names I see in the audience. And so this is just like a really magical experience for me. So thank you all so much. I think I'll start just quickly with Anne's question and probably not answer it directly, but in many ways, well, this project started as my dissertation, and my dissertation started actually about a project on this question of lesbians and HIV and what was happening in these early days of the AIDS crisis. But in researching that, I was in the archives, the Lesbian Feminist Periodicals archives at Duke, and I came across the Clit Papers. And this encounter with the Clit Papers reawakened something in me, or I'm not even sure if reawakened is right, but it was exactly at this moment, this was about 10 years ago, when I think that, this question of the death of the lesbian, when the end of Michigan Women's Music Festival, the end of the Lex, was alive. And here I was just with the Clit Papers being this is where it's at, And so for me, I really came into lesbian life and lesbian community as a late teenager. And at the time, I was a student in a small Catholic college in Massachusetts. And so in many ways, my contact with with lesbian community was sort of indirect. So I first found lesbian life in the stacks of the library, in the HQ 75 section specifically, but also in the periodicals section where my school stocked Curve, Off Our Backs, On Our Backs, which was kind of hidden, or you could find in some ways, people would sneak it there. And of course, Sinister Wisdom. And so to be here tonight with a book that lives in the HQ 75 section on a panel with Sinister Wisdom is just it's truly beyond my wildest imagination. So I want to also just thank Julie, and the opportunity to grow our friendship and my relationship with you and with Sinister Wisdom as I've navigated this book has been so life-giving, and I'm so grateful. And And I want to also acknowledge, I think, what Olivia you were pointing to. So, I had already named this book and written a good chunk of it and sent it off as Lesbian Death when the COVID pandemic started. And so, I think I spent a lot of time thinking about how to think about this word death, and I did obviously come to it as the title and this analytic that I sort of follow around. But of course, sitting here where we are now, these questions of death are taking on new and different meanings, and I want to both acknowledge that and also talk about the time of the pandemic, which is, of course, this horrifying time that we are very much still in, but also this time where I was very isolated finishing up this book, and would come to these Sinister Wisdom events on Zoom where there would be 350 intergenerational lesbians hanging out. And it was such to find that space in this time and in this weird way that we do life together now, I just think really speaks to the persistence of lesbian life that I try to point to in this book. And I want to say that for me, what drew me to this book was not only my own ambivalence and sort of struggle with my relationship to this language of lesbian, or to the claim I am a lesbian. I like to say, much like Bell Hooks, I prefer to say not that I am a lesbian, but that I advocate lesbianism. But the best part about writing this book was getting to pay homage to all the ways that lesbian life and lesbian culture has been such a source of vitality and joy for me. But when I started the project, or what I couldn't have imagined, that seems silly in retrospect, was how this book would bring me back into lesbian community, and how this book would be such a bridge to these really sustaining intellectual, but I think also interpersonal relationships that I'm getting to build with my panelists, with people in the audience, and with this wider community of us who are really committed to lesbian life and to lesbian persistence and to grappling with the many things that means. So thank you all so much for being here with me.
Thank you so much, Mairead. Thank you to everyone on our panel. We have reached that time where we encounter Zoom fatigue. And so the way we counter that here is to dance. I appreciate you all coming. I want to highlight a couple events. I'm doing this from memory. Next Thursday, we are doing a memorial service for Anita Cornwell. If you're not familiar with Black Lesbian in White America, I commend it to you. This program, folks, is going to be fantastic and really moving. So we have great speakers, and it's going to be just a quiet, reflective, wonderful moment to think about Anita. So that is next Thursday, September 21st at 7 p.m. October 3rd, Tuesday, back to our usual Tuesday night, we're doing Black Lesbian Publishing in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. All our events, we're putting the link in there, and then we're having our big launch event for the Giant Vulva issue, Sinister Wisdom 130. That will be happening on Tuesday, October 17th. I hope you will enjoy us. I hope you will join us for them all. I hope you will enjoy it all. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, Mairead, for writing such a wonderful book. Thank you to all of our panelists. And Max, start the song so I can shut up.
Come on and say the L word. It's the only chance you got to stop the
Thank you all. We'll see you at our next event.